Okay, we're in the bottom of DAF Yud Beis Amid Beis, and we're quoting from the Mishnah, Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Omer Talmid Echad Chulei, Rabbi Akiva Omer Alzeh Ve'alzeh Nechlaku. So we have a student that goes over to Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yishmael testifies about this, and he says that even though the Chachamim are of the opinion that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that we documented in the Mishnah, the machlokas is, do you need both a lechi and a korah at the entrance to a mavoi? Or is it sufficient to just have a lechi or a korah? That's what Beis Hillel say. The machlokas seems to be anytime you have an entrance to a mavoi. A certain student goes over to Rabbi Akiva and suggests that the machlokas is only when the entranceway is wider than 4 amos. But if it's narrower than 4 amos, then everyone agrees that either a lechi or a korah is sufficient. Rabbi Akiva says, no, you're mistaken. The machlokas is both when it's wider than 4 amos and when it's narrower than 4 amos. So the Gemara asks the first question, Rabbi Akiva hainu tanakama. Rabbi Akiva seems to be saying the exact same thing as the Chachamim of our Mishnah, the anonymous author of our Mishnah. What is he coming to add or alter from the position of the Tanakama, which is that the machlokas is across the board? So the Gemara answers, Ika beinaihu de Rav Achli vitema Rav Yechiel velo Masayimi. Answers the Gemara, there is one important difference between the two. We have both opinions maintain that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is across the board, regardless of whether the opening of the mavoi is wider or narrower than 4 amos. But we saw something yesterday which said that there's a minimal measurement. According to Rav Achli, if the opening to the mavoi is narrower than 4 tefachim, then you don't need to put either a lechi or a korah on the entranceway because it's such a narrow aperture. And on that we have a machlokas, meaning that we have two opinions. We're not sure which one is which, but either the Chachamim hold like Rav Achli and Rabbi Akiva doesn't, and he would hold that you, even when it's narrower than 4 tefachim, you still need to put a lechi or a korah, and or vice versa, or Rabbi Akiva holds like Rav Achli and the Chachamim disagree. So that's the difference between the two. Tanya. So now we have a brisa which says, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Lo Amar Rabbi Yishmael davar zeh, ela oso Talmid Amar davar zeh. So the first thing that Rabbi Akiva says is that Rabbi Yishmael never suggested this distinction between wider than 4 amos and narrower than 4 amos regarding the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. He never could have said it. It could only have been that student who said it. Now, Rashi explains that what Rabbi Akiva is trying to convey is that Rabbi Yishmael is too smart to make that mistake. He's too smart to be able to create that kind of distinction when that distinction does not exist. And so therefore it must have been a student who was still in the process of learning, and that's why it couldn't have been Rabbi Yishmael. But then he says, V'halacha ka'oso Talmud. But then he says, but yet the halacha is like that anonymous student. So the Gemara says, Hagufa kasha. Amart lo amar Rabbi Yishmael davar zeh, alma les ilchas hakavasei, v'hadar amart halacha ka'oso Talmud. First you start saying, it can't possibly have been Rabbi Yishmael who said it because the halacha is not like that statement, and therefore Rabbi Yishmael, who's too smart for that, could not have made that mistake. And then you end up saying that the halacha is like that student, so you're contradicting yourself. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel lo Amar Rabbi Akiva elo lechadei ba hatalmidim. Rabbi Akiva only said it to sharpen the students. What does that mean? He said it to sharpen the students. Really, Rabbi Akiva agreed that the halacha is not like that student, but he said it only in order to impress the other students and show them, I'm really impressed with that guy, that anonymous student who came to me and made that suggestion. So much so that the halacha is like him, to provoke the other students to be able to want to engage in innovations in halacha. Right? But the halacha is really not like that student. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Nirin Itmar. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says that it's not that Rabbi Akiva said the halacha is like that student, because the halacha is not like that student, but it's what he was trying to convey is that there's a logic to what that student is saying. And that's what he was saying in order to impress the students. Tosfos says essentially these two answers are the same, but one is sort of using a hyperbolic language of halacha ka'oso Talmud, and Rav Nachman is saying no, he never said halacha ka'oso Talmud, he just said nirin. He said it seems like he's right, but he never actually said that we paskin like that. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Kol Makom Sha'ata Motze Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, Amar Talmid Echad Lefnei Rabbi Akiva, Eino Elo Rabbi Meir. Anytime you find that language where Rabbi Yishmael cites a certain student who said something in the presence of Rabbi Akiva, he's referring to Rabbi Meir, who was, of course, the next generation down from Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva, by the way, is credited by historians as preserving Jewish knowledge, and Rabbi Meir is credited with the very same thing in the following generation. These were precarious times because of Roman persecution. And what we know about Rabbi Meir? Shishimeshus Rabbi Yishmael vis Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Meir was a student who basically attended to his two Rebbeim, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya. And how do we know this? The Brisa says, Amar Rabbi Meir, Kishahayisi Eitzel Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Meir says that when I was by Rabbi Yishmael, Hayisi Matil Kan Kantom L'Sochadjio V'lo Amar Li Davar. I used to put kan kantom, which is a certain indelible dye. They translate it as vitriol, which usually the term vitriol we use in a descriptive manner of a person's personality, but actually it comes from this very dark, black kind of indelible ink. I used to put this kan kantom into my ink when I would write it for writing a Sefer Torah. And Rabbi Yishmael didn't say anything in protest, but Keshabasi Eitzel Rabbi Akiva Asra Alai. But when I came to Rabbi Akiva and I told him what I had done, he told me that was forbidden. Now, why it's forbidden, we'll see. Why it's forbidden to make indelible ink. So the Gemara now says, Aini, is this really so? And we're going to challenge the two things about this brisa. The Ha'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Meir Kishahayisi Lomeid Eitzel Rabbi Akiva Hayisi Matil Kan Kantom L'Sochadjo V'Lomar Li Davar. This story is just the opposite, that Rabbi Meir says that when I was by Rabbi Akiva, I placed the kan kantom indelible dye into my ink, and he did not protest. So automatically we see two problems. First of all, it sounds like over here that Rabbi Meir first went to Rabbi Akiva and then later went to Rabbi Yishmael, whereas in the previous story, he first was by Rabbi Yishmael and then went to Rabbi Akiva. And the second problem that we have with the story is that in the previous story, Rabbi Akiva says it's usher to do that, and over here he has no problem. And then later, when I came to Rabbi Yishmael, he said to me, when he heard that I was putting this indelible dye into the ink, he said, my son, what do you do for a living? What is your occupation? Amarti lo lavler ani. I told him I'm a sofer. So I write Sifrei Torah. So Amar li b'ni havei zohir b'malachtecha. So Rabbi Shmuel said, be very careful with your labor, shemalachtecha malecha shemayimi, because your labor is heavenly work. You're doing God's work. And Shema ata mechaser os echas o meyaser os echas nimseis machrivis kol ha'olam kulo. That if you would write one letter too much or one letter missing, you could destroy the entire world. Now, what does that mean? You could destroy the entire world. Rashi gives us two examples. There's a pasuk in the Navi that says, Vashem Elokim Emes. If a person will leave out the letter Aleph from the word Emes, it's Vimes. Chas v'sholom, God dies, right? So that's not something that's a destructive statement. That's like destroying the whole world, so to speak. And the other example of adding a letter is that instead of saying Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, if you added a vav to Vayidaber, it would Vayidabru. And that would imply that there's a multiplicity of gods, and that would also be a destructive thing. So just adding or subtracting one letter could destroy the entire world.
Maybe the concept of destroying the entire world is like when you save someone, you save the entire world because you're saving future generations. So too, if you make a mistake.
Beautiful thought. Good. So Amarti lo davar echad yeshli v'kan kanton shemosh animata l'sochad yo. So Rabbi Meir says, I said back to Rabbi Shmuel, not to worry. I have an indelible dye called kan kantom that I place inside my ink, so that's going to be my safeguard, which of course is very bizarre. How does putting indelible dye into ink protect you from adding or subtracting letters? It doesn't make any sense. So Amar what?
It'd be very expensive. You don't want to waste a letter.
Okay, so we'll see. So Amar li v'chi matilin kan kantom l'sochad yo. So Rabbi Shmuel protests. He says, how can you put this indelible stuff into the ink? V'halo amra Torah v'chasav u'macha. Doesn't the Torah say, in the context of the sota procedure, that you have to write the parsha of the sota on her parchment, stick it into the water, stir it all up, and the Torah says umacha, and then you have to dissolve the ink. The ink has to dissolve off the parchment, which means that it cannot be indelible. So ksav sheyochel limchos, it has to be dissolvable. So the Gemara says, first of all, before we get into our kasha, Maika Amarleu, Maika Mahadrle, what was Rabbi Shmuel saying, and what was Rabbi Meir responding? And it doesn't seem like Rabbi Meir's response of I have indelible ink. How does that attend to the concern of adding or subtracting a letter? Hachi Kamarlan. So what he was saying is like this: Lo mi baya b'chaseres u'v'yisiris delo ta'ina debaki ana. So Rabbi Meir was saying, Rabbi Shmuel, not to worry. Not only do you not have to worry that I'm going to add or subtract the letter, because I'm quite an expert, I'm a professional, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm not going to make that mistake. Ela afilu mechash l'zvuv nami dilma asi v'yosef atagi d'dalas u'machik le'umash v'lei reish. Then davar echad yesh li v'kankantum shemosh animata l'sochad yo. He says, but even if your concern would be that after I write the letters properly, a fly may come down and rest upon the freshly written ink on the parchment and may rest upon the corner of the dalid and may scrape off some of the ink and turn the dalid into a reish. And therefore, even though I'm an expert, there's still a concern. He says that also you don't have to be worried about Rabbi Yishmael, because I have an indelible dye that once it goes onto the parchment, it can never come off. That's what Rabbi Meir was saying. So in any event, the Gemara says, okay, fine, but kasha shimush ashimush, kasha asra asra. But still we have a contradiction between these two accounts, because the first brisa says that first Rabbi Meir went to Rabbi Shmuel and later went to Rabbi Akiva, and the latter brisa says just the opposite. And secondly, the first brisa says that Rabbi Shmuel permitted the kan kantom and Rabbi Akiva asred it, and the latter brisa says just the opposite. So the Gemara says, Bishlam ashimush ashimush lo kasha miikara asa lekami de Rabbi Akiva umidolo matzi lamekam alibe asa lekami de Rabbi Shmuel v'gomar Gemara v'hadar asa lekami de Rabbi Akiva v'sovar svara. The Gemara says we can reconcile the contradiction between whether he went first to Rabbi Shmuel or first to Rabbi Akiva. Here's what happened. First, Rabbi Meir, as a novice, went to Rabbi Akiva. He figured, let me go to the best. The problem is that if you go to the top shear before you've learned enough, you won't know what's flying, right? So therefore, he went too high. He hadn't yet studied all of the Mishnayos, and he was now going to Rabbi Akiva shear, the prerequisite for that shear was a knowledge of Mishnah. So Rabbi Meir didn't know what was going on in Rabbi Akiva shear. So he basically then went to Rabbi Yishmael, who gave the lower shear in the yeshiva for guys who needed to learn Mishnayos. And he learned all the Mishnayos with Rabbi Yishmael, and then he advanced later on to Rabbi Akiva shear and was able to learn Svara, what we call Gemara today, which is the ability to extrapolate and to expound upon the discussions of the Mishnah, which is what the Talmudic discussions are all about. Right. Logic. So first he went to Rabbi Akiva, realized it was too high, then went to Rabbi Yishmael and learned what he needed to learn, and then advanced back to Rabbi Akiva shir. So Ella Asra Kasha. But what about the contradiction between the first account, which is that Rabbi Yishmael permitted and Rabbi Akiva forbade, and the latter brisa, which is just the opposite? So the Gemara says, you're right, Kasha, we don't have a resolution to that. We're going to have to go weiter. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Meir Haya Omer, L'chol matilin kan kantom l'sochad yo chutz mi parsha sota. That according to Rabbi Meir, you're allowed to put this indelible kan kantom into your ink to write every section of the Sefer Torah except for the portion of the sota. Why? Because the portion of the sota has to be soluble to be used in case you wanted to use that actual portion of the Torah for your elixir. You have to, in case you wanted to cut it out, you'd have to be able to do that. 1 second. But Rabbi Yaakov Omer Mishmo, chutz mi parsha sota shebemikdash. And Rabbi Yaakov disagrees. He says, no, you could write the entire Sefer Torah, including the parsha of sota, with indelible ink. The only thing that cannot be with indelible ink is the actual parchment that you write in the Beis HaMikdash that the Kohen writes. So my beinayu. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? Amar Rav Yirmiyah limchok la min haTorah ika beinayu. That the question is, can you use the portion of sota that you write when you write the Sefer Torah? Can you cut that out and use that as the thing that you're going to mix in the elixir for the sota? and v'hani tanoi ki hani tanoi, and it's the same machlokas as follows. The Tanya, ein megilasa ksheira lahashkos basota acheres, and Rabbi Achi bar Yoshi amar megilasa ksheira lahashkos basota acheres. There's a machlokas. What happens if a man brings his wife to the Beis Hamikdash suspecting her as a sota, and the Kohen is about to make her drink, and then all of a sudden she says, I confess, I don't want to drink. So in that case, he's already written the parchment. Can you use that parchment for the next woman who comes to the Beis Hamikdash, even though it was not written for her? So this is a machlokas tanoim. The Tanakama says no, and Rabbi Achi says that you are allowed to use it. So what we want to suggest, therefore, is as follows. When you write a Sefer Torah, you're not writing it for that specific woman. Can you still use it and cut it out and then use it for that specific woman who comes to the Beis HaMikdash? According to Rabbi Achi, you can, and therefore you have to make sure that that portion of the Torah is written on erasable ink. But according to the Chachamim who say that no, it can't be used anyway because it wasn't written for her sake, so then it could be written on indelible ink because you're never going to use it for the sota. So Amar Rav Papa, no, Dil Malohi. Rav Papa says that's not necessary. You can't necessarily correlate that issue to this machlokas because ad kan lo ka'amar tanakama hasam ela keven de intuk l'shum rachel sulo haja mintika l'shum leah avol gabi Torah d'stama michta v'hachanami d'machkinan. Maybe I'll argue that everyone agrees that you could take the portion from the Torah scroll and cut it out and use it for the sota elixir. Maybe only over there does the Tanakama say that you can't, because since it was written for a specific woman, let's say her name is Rachel, you can't later on use it for the next woman whose name is Leah. Because once you had one woman in mind, you can't use it for another woman. But when you write a Sefer Torah, you don't have any woman in mind, and therefore maybe it's perfectly usable for a woman later on. Maybe the only problem of using it for woman B when it was written for woman A was because you had one specific woman in mind when you wrote it. But here you didn't have any specific woman in mind, so it's perfectly fine. Alternatively, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Dilmalo, he had Kanlo Kamar Rabbi Achi bar Yoshi, Asam ala dichtav mias l'shum sota ba'olam. Aval gabe Torah lihislami ksiv, hachanami delo machkinan. So the Gemara says, I'll give you another way of looking at it, says Rav Nachman. He says, I'll look at it the other way. Maybe the only time Rabbi Achi says that you could use a piece of parchment that was written for Rachel, that you could use it for Leah instead, is because the first parchment was written for the sake of a sota. It was written to be used in the sota procedure. And therefore, if you can't use it for that woman, you could use it for another woman, says Rabbi Achi. But over here, when you wrote a Sefer Torah, you wrote it for studying Torah. You didn't write it for to be used in a sota procedure. And maybe, therefore, even Rabbi Achi would agree that you cannot use it. So, therefore, the Gemara says that you cannot possibly correlate this machlokas as to whether the portion of the Torah needs to be written on erasable ink or not to the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Achi, because they could be talking about apples and oranges. So now the Gemara says, but let's go to that machlokas for a second. Remember, Rabbi Achi is of the opinion that you could write a parchment for Sota A, and if Sota A doesn't need it, you could use it for Sota B. So the Gemara says, "V'leslei l'Rabbi Achi bar Yoshi ahaditnan kasav get l'garish es ishto v'nimlach u'metzo ben iro v'amar shimcha kishmi v'shenishtucha kishenishti pasal l'garish bo." We know there's a halacha as follows. It's a very famous halacha in Maseches Gittin. Let's say Ruvain decides he's going to divorce his wife, and all of a sudden she sweetens up, and she becomes a nice lady. She makes him a nice dinner. She's very nice to him, and they reconcile. But in the meantime, he had already hired a scribe, and he had written that his wife Rachel he's going to divorce, and they live in Minsk, whatever it is, and he's going to divorce her. Ruvain from Minsk is going to divorce his wife Rachel. Comes along another guy named Ruvain, lives in Minsk also, and he says, "Hey, Ruvain Schwartz, my name is Ruvain Bernstein. I have an idea. I want to divorce my wife. Her name is Rachel too. I can save a lot of money. I can not only get rid of my wife, but I can do it at a discount. Let me use you already wrote a get. It says Ruvain from Minsk is divorcing his wife Rachel. Fits me. Can I use it?" So the halacha is no, you're not allowed to, because it has to be written for the sake of that particular woman that's being divorced. So how could Rabbi Achi say possibly by Sota that it doesn't have to be written for that specific woman? You see by the laws of Gittin that it has to be written for a specific woman. So the Gemara says, Hachi hashta hasam b'chasav laksiv, ba'inan ksiva lishma. The answer is because by the laws of get, the Torah writes, v'kosav la, he shall write it for her. Therefore, it says quite explicitly in the Torah, it has to be written for the sake of one specific woman. But hacha ve'asalaksiv ba'inan asiya lishma and asiya dida mechigahi. But over here by sota, it says he shall make it for her. Make it for her means it has to be specifically, the procedure has to be done specifically for that one woman. But the procedure is not the writing. The procedure is the erasing and mixing in the water. So therefore, according to Rabbi Achi, you don't need it to be the parchment for sota to be written for her. It has to be mixed in the water and erased for her sake. And if it's erased for her and not for, then you can't use it for another woman. That's for sure. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, Amar Rabbi Acha Rav Bar Chanina, Galui v'yadua lifnei misha ha'amar v'haya ha'olam she'ein b'doros Rabbi Meir kamosa. Now we're going back to the story of Rabbi Meir. Now remember, Rabbi Meir was the one who was that Talmud Echad, who's that student who went before Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva said, I'm sorry, you're mistaken, we're not going to go like you. Because you say that there's a difference between less than 4 amos and more than 4 amos in the entrance way to the Mavli. So the Gemara now wants to make a point. Don't think that Rabbi Meir was a slouch. It's well known before Hashem that Rabbi Meir was the singular greatest person in his generation. But then why did they not rule the halacha like him? Shelo yachlu chaverav la'amod al sof daito shahaya omer al tamei tohar umar lo panim, and then also al tohar tamei umar lo panim. The reason is because Rabbi Meir was so brilliant that everything that came out of his mouth was convincing, and there was no way to ever know when he was right and when he was wrong, because he would expound on saying something that was tamei, that it was tahar, and he would be able to prove his argument. He would say something that was tahar, that it was really tamei, and he would be able to prove his argument. And he was therefore so convincing that there was never a way to know when he was right and when he was wrong. And so they made across-the-board policy. We can't go like this, Rabbi Meir, because he's just going to, he runs circles around everybody, and is so convincing that we never know when. In other words, he had this power, Rabbi Meir. Whether it was rhetorical power, whether it was logical power, whatever his power was, he was so convincing that sometimes when a person is so convincing, you know that there's something wrong. It's almost like the halacha that when the Sanhedrin is unanimous to convict a victim, then you know that there's something wrong. Right? It's the same principle over here. He was so convincing that he was never wrong. So therefore they said, we can't rely on our own judgment and ever go like Rabbi Meir.
Was that like always, or just in this case?
It seems to me, it's a good point, because there are plenty of times we go like we paskin like Rabbi Meir. Stam Mishnah, Rabbi Meir, right? So it seems to me this was only when he was a student and the elder generation was still around. But once the elder generation died off and he became the Gadol Hador, then it would seem like he prevailed over the generation. That's my thinking. I didn't really research it though, Shlomi. So Tana lo Rabbi Meir shemo ela Rabbi Nahoroi shemo, v'lama nikra shemo Rabbi Meir shehu Meir einei chachamim b'halacha. The Brisa says his name was not really Rabbi Meir, but rather Rabbi Nahoroi. Now, why was he called Rabbi Meir? Because the word Meir means to illuminate. He used to illuminate the eyes of the chachamim with his halacha, with his ability to expound on Jewish law. V'lo Nehoroi shemo, and furthermore, his name wasn't really even Nehoroi. Ela Rabbi Nechemya shemo, v'amri la Rabbi Elazar ben Arach shemo. But really, his name was either Rabbi Nechemya. Some say it was the famous Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who was the student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. V'lama nikra shemo Nehoroi, but why was he called Nehoroi? Shem manhir enei chachamim b'halacha. That again, the word manhir is to illuminate. He would illuminate the eyes of the chachamim b'halacha. The question, of course, is what's the difference between Meir and Nehoroi? That they mean the same thing. I think one is Aramaic and one is Hebrew, and therefore it could be that the difference is, was he brilliant in his Mishnaic knowledge, which is the Hebrew, or was he brilliant in Talmudic knowledge, which is the Aramaic? But either way, there's something subtle in the difference between Meir and Nehoroi, even though they mean the same thing. Amar Rebbe, some say the Girsa is Amar Rav. Hi de mechadadna mechavroi. The reason why I'm sharper than my colleagues is the chazise la Rabbi Meir me'achorei. Is because one time, when Rabbi Meir was quite elderly and he was still alive, I was able to see him from afar, but I saw his back. V'ilu chazise mikamei hava mechadin notfei. If I would have seen his face,
I would be even sharper than I am today, because just seeing the illumination off his face would make me wise. Dichsiv v'hayu einecha ro'os esmorecha, as the pasuk says, your eyes shall gaze upon your teacher, and that's how you will gain wisdom. Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Talmud hayalola Rabbi Meir v'sumcha shema. Rabbi Meir had a student who apparently was as convincing as his Rebbe, right? And his name was Sumchas. Shahaya Omer al kol davar v'davar shel tuma arboim ushmona ta'amei tuma ve'al kol davar v'davar shel tahara arboim ushmona ta'amei tahara. That for everything that was declared to be tamei, he would give 48 reasons for it to be tamei, and for everything that was Torah, he'd give 48 reasons for it to be Torah. 48, of course, is the number in the Mishnah of 48 ways to acquire wisdom. So this was a sign that he was extremely wise. Talmud vasik haya biyavna. Now the Brisa tells us something even more than that. There was a certain very sharp student, vasik, elderly student in Yavna, shahaya metayrus asheretz b'meya v'chamisha ta'amim, that he was able to give 150 reasons why a sheretz should be Torah. Now we know that the Torah says that a sheretz is tameh, so obviously he was giving erroneous reasons. But the point of this Gemara is to tell us that just using logic alone is not going to get you to the truth. A person can be very, very cunning, but that doesn't mean that he's right. Okay, so that's a very important principle. Amar Ravina ani adon v'taharenu. So Ravina says, let me give you one of the reasons why a sheretz should be tohar. Uma nacha shemeimis umar betuma tohar, sheretz she'ein meimis umar betuma lo kol shekain. Because look, a serpent, a snake through its snake bite kills human beings and increases tumas meis in the world. And yet the dead carcass of a snake does not transmit tumah because it's not a sheretz. So surely a sheretz, which is harmless to human beings, surely its carcass should not transmit tumah. That's one of the arguments, right? The Gemara says velohi, but that's actually not a legitimate argument because ma'isa kotes ba'alma ka'avid. Because when a snake bites and it kills, it's only doing that which a poisonous thorn would do. A serpent kills by instinct. It's not that it's not a force of death in the world. It's just that God created in the world certain things that if you come into their purview or they come into your purview, you die from them because they're toxic, they're dangerous, but it's not something that sort of proactively goes out and brings about tumah in the world. It's you who go into the trespasses or the domain of the snake. You're the one that gets killed because you bumped up against it. So therefore, it's not that the snake is considered to be a source of tumah in the world. It's just like any thorn. It's like anything that you would rub up against. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel Shalosh Shanim Nechleku Beishamai Beisila. For 3 years, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed on a variety of halachos. Halalu omrim halacha kimosenu, v'halalu omrim halacha kimosenu. Each party maintained the halacha was like their academy. Yatsa baskol v'amra elu ve'elu divrei elokim chayim. A heavenly voice emanated forth and said, both this and this are the word of the living God. Now a lot of people quote this, and sometimes they misapply it, because this quote only appears twice in all of Shas. And the important thing to remember is just because two people have an opinion doesn't mean you could always say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Sometimes one guy is right and one guy is wrong, and that's just the end of the story, right? In other words,
several people use this line quite often.
Well, all right, whoever uses it, the point is that you can't. Many times, one person's, like someone was telling me that he once witnessed a discussion where two people were arguing, and the guy said, "All right, listen, elu divrei Elokim chayim." The other guy said, "Not in this case." Right? So anyway, so you have to know when to apply. But certainly in the case of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, they were both so immersed in Torah study that they were both right. But the halacha kebeis Hillel, but nevertheless the halacha at the end of the day is like Beis Hillel. So frak the Gemara v'chimei achar she'elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim ipnei ma zachu Beis Hillel l'kvo halacha kemosa. Well, then why, if both of them are the word of the living God, why then was Beis Hillel privileged to have the halacha established like them? I mean, after all, Beis Shammai is also true in the eyes of Hashem. The answer is Mipnei shenochin v'alu v'nhayu v'shonin divreim v'divrei Beis Shammai. The answer is because they're easygoing, they're humble, they allow themselves to be lowered, and they cite not only their teachings but the teachings of their opponents Beis Shammai. V'lo od ela shemakdivin divrei Beis Shammai lidivreim. Not only that, but they even precede their words, they precede Beis Shammai's words to their words, to show just how humble they are. Ka'osa sheshaninu, like here's an example. There's a Mishnah in Sukkah which says, Misha Hirosha Veruba B'Sukkah, V'Shulchana B'Socha Bayis, Beis Shammai Posel, Beis Hillel Machshirin. That if a person's body, the majority of his body and his head are inside the sukkah, but his table where his food is outside the sukkah, so Beis Shammai say that you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of yeshiva sukkah, and Beis Hillel says no, it's still kosher. So Amru Beis Hillel leBeis Shammai lo kach haya ma'aser shalchu ziknei Beis Shammai v'ziknei Beis Hillel levakas Rabbi Yochanan ben Achornis u'mitzauhu yoshev v'rosha v'ruba b'sukkah v'shulchana b'socha bayis. So Beis Hillel says to Beis Shammai, but wait a minute, there was a time when the elders of Beis Shammai went with the elders of Beis Hillel to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben Achornis, and they found him in that exact position. The majority of his body and his head was inside the sukkah, and his table with his food was outside the sukkah. So you see that that's acceptable. So Amru lahen Beis Shammai misham raya apein Amru lo im kacha yisanoi lo kiyamta mitzvah sukkah miyamecha. That Beis Shammai said back to Beis Hillel, if you're bringing a proof from there, then you got to finish the story, because our elders who went with your elders to visit Rabbi Yochanan told him when they saw the way he was positioned, they said, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah your entire life if this is the way your sukkah's been for all this time. But what do you see from the story? How did Beis Hillel recount the story of the visit to Rabbi Yochanan? They said the story was that the elders of Shammai went with the elders of Hillel. They placed the elders of Shammai in the story before they discussed the elders of Hillel. So that shows you how humble they were. This teaches you that anyone who lowers himself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will raise up. If you humble yourself, Hashem will cause you to elevate. And if you elevate yourself, if you try to make yourself important, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will flatten you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will lower you. Furthermore, B'chol ha'machazer ala gedula, gedula barachas mimenu, b'chol ha'bareach min ha'gedula, gedula mechazeres achrav. Anyone, this is, by the way, quite often misquoted, but the quote is actually this. It's not kol ha'bareach achar ha'kavod. It's kol ha'machazer ala gedula. Anyone who seeks greatness, greatness will run away from you. But if you run away from greatness, greatness will pursue you. So there's a famous story about one of the students of the Chidushei Harim. He said to his Rebbe, all my life I've been running away from greatness, and greatness has never pursued me. So the Chidushei Harim, you know what he said to him? He says, because when you were running away, you looked over your shoulder to see if greatness was following you. When greatness saw that, greatness ran away. Right? So obviously, what's the conveyance of the story? The story means is that it's not a magical formula that if you run away from kavod, kavod will catch up with you. So therefore, I'll pretend that I'll pretend that I don't want it. You really have to not want it, and that's when you ascend to greatness. And then the Gemara says that if a person pushes the hour pushes back. But if you are flexible because of the hour, then the hour will succeed for you. Now what that means is that what Rashi explains is you have to know when the forces are against you. You have to know that you're not in the driver's seat. HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs this show. So if you're involved in an endeavor, and every step of the way in the endeavor, it's gaitnish. Nothing seems to be working, right? You try this way, you try that way, and you're saying it's not going. So at some point you have to say, all right, it's not going, so it's not meant to be. But if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, then eventually the whole thing will explode in your face. Because you have to realize that you have to take the signs that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sending your way. And if you are flexible and you say, you know what, as important or as good as I thought this was going to be, it's not meant to be, and you're flexible, then eventually you'll succeed, and Hashem will cause your endeavor to be very enterprising. Tana Rabbanan, Shtei Shanim u'mechsa nechluku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. That for 2.5 years, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed on the following issue, which is one of the most fundamental principles in Jewish theology. Halalu omrim noach lo la'adam shelo nivra Yosef mishenivra, v'halalu omrim noach lo la'adam shenivra Yosef mishelo nivra. Right? Noach lo. So it's better for a person to never have been created than to have been created. And the other party says, no, it's better for a person to have been created than not to have been created. and Nimnu V'Gamru, and they took a vote, and in this particular case, as the Meforshim explained, Beis Shammai overpowered or was able to prevail over Beis Hillel using their arguments, and they finally concluded that Noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yosem mishenivra, achshav shenivra yifashvesh b'masav amalo yamashmesh b'masav. It really is better for a person to never have been created than to have been created. But now that he has been created, he should either be mefashvesh b'masav, and some say yamashmesh b'masav. The difference between the two is that yefashvesh means he should look back upon his past deeds, scrutinize them, and see what he needs to do tshuva for. Yamashmesh means that he's got to think about what he's about to do, and then realize and try to make sure that he carefully weighs everything that he's about to do to make sure that he does the right thing and avoids doing the wrong thing. The question, of course, is how could you possibly say that it's better not to have been created than to have been created? Are you denying God's ultimate plan? Right? So the Ishbitzer and many other Meforshim say as follows. The language is very exact. It doesn't say tov lo. It doesn't say that it's better not to have been created. It says noach lo. What does noach mean? It's easier, or maybe more pleasant also. But it would have been easier for you never to have been created than to have been created. Meaning that life is very tough. It's a tremendously difficult to go through an entire lifetime, right? But obviously, once you go through it, in retrospect, it was worth it. Even with all of the difficulties and all of the pitfalls and all of the challenges. But that's what Hashem wants. Hashem wants a person to struggle and to strive and to really go through difficulties in life. But at the end of the day, it ain't easy. It'd be much easier if God gave you the option and said, you want the easy path or the hard path. A lot of people might want to take the easy path, but Hashem says, no, I want you to take the hard path. That's what Noach means. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. There's much more to be said. We got to finish the Mishnah and then we'll be done. Hakora sha'amru rechava kedei lakabel ariach. That when we say that you have to have a korah at the entranceway to the Mavi, you have either a korah or a lechi. So the korah has to be wide enough that it can support an ariach. Now what is an ariach? A ariach chatzi levena shel shel shetfachim. An ariach is a half a brick. A brick is 3 tfachim in length, and a ariach is 1.5 tfachim. So you would say that if it's got to be wide enough to support an ariach, then how wide does the korah have to be? It should have to be 1.5 tfachim, but that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, "Dai lekor shetei rechava tefach kedei lekabel ariach l'rachbo." Now, and therefore, all you need is for the korah to be 1 tefach wide, in order to accommodate the width of an ariach, which is a 1.5 tefach brick. The question, of course, is how does 1.5 turn into 1 tefach? So the Gemara will have to explain this. Now, rechava kedei lekabel ariach, ubria kedei lekabel ariach. So the Tanakam is of the opinion that not only does it have to be wide enough to accommodate, to seat an ariach, but it also has to be sturdy and strong enough to support the weight of an ariach, of a brick. So Rabbi Yehuda omer rechava afal pi she'ein beria, and Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says no. Even it just has to be wide enough, and even if it's not sturdy enough because it's made of very flimsy material, it's still a valid korah. Ha'isa shel kash v'shel kanim, and therefore he says that if it was made out of straw or of very light flimsy sticks, roan osa ki'ilu hi shel mateches, that you look at it as if it's made out of metal, and therefore it's still a kosher korah. This is all according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would seem like. Akuma roan osa ki'ilu hi pshuta, that furthermore, if the korah is bent in such a way that it cannot support an ariach because it's bent in such a way that it's not going to be able to hold the ariach because it'll fall off, so then you look at it as if the korah is straight and could still support an ariach. And agula, if the circumference of the korah is round, just imagine like a broomstick, right? A big broomstick is the korah, so you can't put a brick on top of a broomstick because it will roll off because it's round in its circumference. But nevertheless, he says, you look at it as if it's squared off, and if it's wide enough in its squared off point to be able to support this half a brick, then it's okay. And how do you know if it's wide enough to support an ariach? You measure the circumference of the stick. And what's the circumference? If the circumference is 3, then you know the diameter is 1 tefach, and therefore, were you to square it off, it would be able to support, it would be 1 tefach wide to support the ariach. Because as we all know, pi is 3, right? And since how do you get the diameter of a circle? You measure the circumference and divide by 3 to get the diameter. Pi is not 3. All right, so we're using approximations.